Let's go live to Washington now for the Australian's correspondent, Adam Creighton. Adam, thank you for staying up till, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. to come on the show to give your take.
Indeed. Thanks, Sharri.
I'm actually so excited to have you on the show tonight because I want to ask you some very interesting and technical questions. Firstly, look, the government is dealing with inflation in Australia, 7.8%. Interest rates that keep rising. We've had 9 consecutive rate rises. There are going to be multiple more, according to the RBA governor. Albanese and Jim Chalmers say all the time, global conditions, supply chains, nothing to do with government. But as you rightly point out in your column, the global supply chain issue was caused by governments, was caused by the government-imposed lockdowns. Talk us through this.
That's right, Sharri. Yeah, they like the phrase supply chain. It's a useful euphemism to kind of pass the buck on to others. But the reality is that Western governments pretty much universally tried to freeze their economies when the pandemic hit. And on top of that, they soaked their economies with hundreds of billions of dollars of new money. In the case of Australia, trillions in the case of the US. And the combination of those two things means that when you lift the lockdowns, you've suddenly got a wall of money that crashes over the economy, and that inevitably pushes up prices. And there's other factors too. For instance, during the lockdowns, a lot of workers left the labour force. So in the US, for instance, the labour force now is something like 164 million. That's actually still smaller than it was at the end of 2019. So that means it's harder for businesses to find workers, and so that pushes up wages, and in turn that pushes up prices as well. So there are many reasons why the fault of inflation is government.
Yeah. Look, I want to ask you about the recession. Look, in Australia, the Treasurer says we're unlikely to go into a recession this year. It is a very fine line that central banks in the US and in Australia are walking, continuing to raise interest rates, but not to the point where it crunches the economy and we go into a recession. How do you think that's looking in the US and globally? And do you think in Australia we will be able to avoid a recession?
Well, look, I think the best guess is that we won't go into recession. And the reason I say that is because of most of last year here in the US, everyone was saying that the US would go into recession, and it simply has not. The job market here is extremely strong. Jobless rate's about 3.5%, just like in Australia, very low. And there have also been very significant raises in interest rates here in the US. They don't seem to have affected the economy yet. So there seems to be underlying strength there. The main risk, of course, is that central banks around the world, they have this thing called credibility, and they need to get the inflation rate back to about 2%. Of course, in the US, it's about 6.5%. In Australia, it's about 7.5%.
It's going to take another couple of years.
And so you can expect
2025 before it's around that 2 to 3%.
Are going to keep going up, and at some point, it will affect the economy, especially in Australia, where most home loans are variable rate, whereas in the US they're not. Most people have a fixed rate 30-year home loan, and so the increases in the Federal Reserve rate here don't affect households like they do back home.
Yeah. Now, tax creep. This is something I want to ask you about as well. We are seeing a lot of finally wages are growing in Australia, very slightly, but there is starting to be wage growth. So you're going to have a lot of Australians who move into a higher tax bracket. Do you think we are going to see this Labor government preside over quite massive and historic tax increases in effect?
Look, it's a very good point, Sharri, and I'm just shocked actually looking at the news back home that no one's really talking about this. I mean, the fact is the tax brackets in Australia are fixed in nominal terms. And if wages catch up to the rate of inflation, which they eventually should do, I know it's quite weak right now, but if they do that, then that's going to be a massive tax increase for the federal government. And yet at the same time, they're still talking about maybe not going through with the so-called stage 3 tax cuts, which is a complete joke in my view. I mean, if wages go up by, say, 8% in the next couple of years, that's probably going to be the biggest income tax increase maybe since the Second World War. And of course, the government won't have to lift a finger. It's just going to happen automatically because the income tax thresholds aren't going to be changed. And so it's really incumbent on the government, I think, now to think seriously about changing those tax thresholds.
Okay, we literally have 30 seconds, Adam, so you're going to have to be so quick here, but you are a super expert. What's your take on the government's proposed super changes?
Well, look, I mean, it's fundamentally flawed, of course, superannuation. It costs taxpayers far more than it saves them in age pension. But, I know that there's this chatter back home about somehow using the money for socially useful projects, well, I'd be supportive of that. But as long as members get to tick a box whether they want their money going into the things the government thinks are good or not. And I'm pretty sure most people won't be ticking that box. So I think that, that probably answers the question about whether or not this is going to be a popular policy. I mean, the purpose of super to the, to the extent that it has a purpose, and of course it's quite amusing, 30 years on, there's still no purpose. But yes, look, it should be to maximise returns for members, not for social projects.
We'll have to have a longer chat about superannuation next time you're on the show, which hopefully will be next week. Adam Creighton,
Sure.
Thank you for staying up so late to join us.
Thanks, Sharri.
Talk soon.